It was a serene afternoon in New York City's iconic Central Park. The gentle rustling of leaves blended with the occasional hum of distant traffic. Amid the tranquil surroundings, a man named Michael Carter, 50 years old and known globally as a Grammy-winning artist, sat unnoticed on a weathered park bench. But today, Michael wasn't here as himself. Disguised in a worn-out jacket, mismatched sneakers, and a crumpled brown paper bag beside him, he looked every bit like a man down on his luck. Michael had a plan, a bold social experiment to reveal how society, particularly law enforcement, treats those who seem powerless. What unfolded would not only challenge authority, but also spark a global conversation about justice and accountability. Michael sat with his hood pulled low over his face, his gaze fixed on the ground. A police cruiser rolled into the gravel parking lot nearby. 2 officers stepped out. Officer Daniel Evans, 28 years old, adjusted his belt, his young face marked with determination. Beside him was Officer Benjamin Harris, 46 years old, his expression weary and his uniform coffee-stained. "Another vagrant," muttered Evans as he nodded toward Michael. "This park's turning into a homeless camp." Harris sighed. "Let's just check him out," he said, lacking enthusiasm. The officers approached, their boots crunching against the gravel. Michael didn't look up. He remained motionless, almost blending into the background. Finally, Evans spoke sharply. "You can't sit here all day. This is a public park, not your living room." Michael slowly looked up. His eyes, partially obscured by the shadow of his hood, met theirs. "I'm not bothering anyone," he said quietly. He reached into his paper bag and pulled out a sandwich, unwrapping it deliberately before taking a bite. His movements were calm, almost meditative. Evans's frustration was immediate. "People like you make the park look bad," he snapped. "You scare off families and tourists." Michael chewed slowly, then replied, "Is eating lunch in a park against the law?" Harris shifted uncomfortably. "He's not doing anything illegal," he muttered. But Evans wasn't satisfied. "Let me see some ID," he demanded. Michael sighed, setting his sandwich down. From his worn coat, he retrieved a leather wallet and handed over an ID that read, "Michael Carter." Evans scrutinized the card, his suspicion growing. "What are you doing here, Carter? Why aren't you at a shelter or something?" Michael's voice remained steady. "I enjoy the fresh air. Is that a problem?" Officer Evans frowned as he handed the ID back. "Your ID checks out, but something about you feels off," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. "Why are you sitting here all alone, just eating a sandwich? Most people would have left by now." Michael glanced at him and took another bite of his sandwich. "I didn't realize sitting on a bench was a crime," he replied calmly. Harris, noticing the growing tension, placed a hand on his partner's shoulder. "Danny, he's not breaking any laws. Let's not escalate this." But Evans's suspicion didn't waver. He stepped closer to Michael, looming over him. "You're acting too calm. People in your situation usually aren't this composed. What are you hiding?" Michael's jaw tightened slightly, but he kept his composure. "I'm hiding nothing," he said firmly. "You're free to search my bag if it makes you feel better." Evans' eyes narrowed. "Fine. Let me see what's in the bag," he said, reaching out toward the crumpled brown paper bag on the bench. Michael calmly handed it over. Evans opened it, finding nothing more than an apple, a half-eaten sandwich, and a bottle of water. He frowned, clearly unsatisfied. "You've got something else on you," Evans pressed. "No one just sits here this casually unless they're up to something." Harris sighed deeply, clearly exasperated. "Danny, you're making this into something it's not. We're not here to harass people for sitting on a bench." Michael tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Is there anything else you'd like to accuse me of?" he asked, his tone even but pointed. The exchange drew the attention of a middle-aged woman walking her dog. She stopped and called out, "He's not hurting anyone." "Why are you bothering him?" Evans turned to her, his tone sharp. "Ma'am, this is none of your concern. Please move along." The woman stood her ground. "This is a public park," she said firmly. "He has as much right to be here as anyone else." Her words caused murmurs among other passers-by who began to gather, observing the situation from a distance. Michael remained silent, a faint smile of amusement crossing his face as he watched the officers grapple with the growing attention. As more people paused to observe, a jogger slowed his pace and glanced over. "What's going on here?" he asked the woman with the dog. She gestured toward Michael. "They're bothering him for sitting on a bench and eating lunch," she said. The jogger frowned, his expression turning to one of disapproval. "Seriously?" he muttered. "Doesn't seem like he's doing anything wrong." Meanwhile, Evans, clearly flustered, gestured at the small crowd. "All of you need to move along. This is police business." But instead of dispersing, the small group began murmuring among themselves. Words like unnecessary and intimidation rippled through the crowd. Harris, sensing the shift in public perception, stepped forward and lowered his voice. "Danny, let's wrap this up," Harris said firmly. "This is getting out of hand." For the first time since the crowd had gathered, Michael spoke directly to the onlookers. "Thank you all for your concern," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm just here enjoying my lunch in the fresh air. I'm not breaking any laws." The jogger crossed his arms, nodding in agreement. "Sounds reasonable to me," he said. Evans's jaw tightened, his frustration evident. "Let's go," he said gruffly to Harris. "But this isn't over." As the officers began to retreat toward their cruiser, Michael watched them go, his expression unreadable. The crowd slowly began to disperse, though their murmurs of discontent lingered in the air. The calm didn't last long. Barely 10 minutes later, the familiar rumble of the police cruiser's engine echoed through the park. Officer Evans, now visibly more agitated, stepped out, his movements brisk and deliberate. Harris followed reluctantly, his face marked with growing unease. "You again," Evans said sharply, striding toward Michael. "Couldn't find another park to loiter in?" Michael remained seated, his posture relaxed. "Didn't realize I was loitering," he said evenly. "I thought I was just sitting on a bench." "Don't get smart with me," Evans snapped, his tone rising. "You're still here, still acting suspicious. I don't know what your game is, but I'm going to find out." Michael tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady but calm. "Is sitting on a bench against the law now?" he asked. Harris stepped in, placing a firm hand on Evans's arm. "Danny, we already talked to him. He's not doing anything wrong. Let's leave it be." But Evans shook him off, his frustration boiling over. "No," he said firmly. "I know something's off with this guy." He turned back to Michael, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "What's in the bag now?" he demanded. Michael let out a quiet sigh, reaching for the paper bag beside him. "Still just my lunch," he said, holding it out. Evans snatched it and rummaged through it again, finding nothing but the same apple and empty sandwich wrapper. Harris sighed heavily. "You're making this worse, Danny. Let's go." But Evans wasn't ready to give up. His eyes narrowed as he leaned closer to Michael. "You're awfully calm for someone getting this much attention," he said. "Most people would be a little more nervous." Michael met his gaze without flinching. "Most people aren't breaking any laws," he replied. Evans turned to Harris, his frustration boiling over. "I'm telling you, there's something off about him," he said, staring after Michael as if trying to memorize every detail. Harris pinched the bridge of his nose, his voice weary. "He's gone. No harm done, Danny. Drop it." Evans shook his head. "No harm yet," he muttered. "But did you see his ID? It looked real, sure, but who carries a wallet like that when they're dressed like him? And what's he doing in this park anyway? It doesn't add up." Harris shrugged and started walking back to the cruiser. "Not our problem," he said flatly. "We're not here to solve riddles. We're here to keep the peace." Evans hesitated for a moment, glancing back toward the bench where Michael had been sitting. His instincts screamed at him that there was more to the man than met the eye. With a reluctant sigh, he followed Harris back to the cruiser. Inside the cruiser, Evans sat with his arms crossed, his frustration etched into his face. "I can't shake it, Ben," he said, his voice low. "The way he talked, the way he moved. It's like he wasn't afraid of us at all. Most people in his position would have panicked." Harris glanced at his partner as he started the engine. "Maybe because he knew he wasn't doing anything wrong," he replied. "We're here to keep the peace, Danny, not to go looking for ghosts." Evans let out a long sigh, staring out the window. "I'm not saying he's guilty of anything," he muttered, "but he's hiding something. I know it." Harris didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. As they pulled away from the park, Evans glanced at the bench one last time, his mind racing with possibilities. Michael remained on the bench, appearing undisturbed as the cruiser disappeared down the park's winding path. His calm demeanor masked an underlying confidence, as though he were playing out a plan that only he fully understood. Nearby, a group of teenagers on bikes approached, their laughter loud and carefree. One boy noticed Michael and gestured for his friends to stop. "Yo, check this guy out," he said with a smirk. The teenagers surrounded the bench, their tone playful but tinged with mockery. "Hey man, what's your story? Lose your house or something?" one boy teased. Michael looked up, his gaze steady but neutral. "Just enjoying the park," he said simply. Another teenager pulled out his phone, holding it up as if to record. "Come on, tell us something for TikTok," he jeered. Michael's expression didn't change. "You should move along," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't a place for games." The tone in his voice caught the boys off guard. They exchanged uncertain glances before deciding to pedal off, their laughter fading as they disappeared down the path. Michael watched them go, a faint smile playing on his lips as he adjusted his hood. Michael's solitude was interrupted again as a pair of joggers approached on the gravel path. One of them, a middle-aged man wearing a sleek fitness tracker, slowed his pace and gave Michael a sideways glance. The man leaned toward his companion, muttering under his breath, "Should we call someone? That guy looks sketchy." His companion, a woman in her early 40s, frowned as she glanced at Michael. Her expression tightened with discomfort. "Maybe we should. He doesn't look like he belongs here," she whispered, loud enough for Michael to hear. Michael opened his eyes, his gaze steady but unreadable as he glanced at the pair. He said nothing, but his calm presence seemed to unnerve them. The man shook his head. "Let's just keep moving," he said, quickening his pace. The woman hesitated, casting one last wary glance at Michael before following her companion. Michael leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes again, as if their presence hadn't affected him in the slightest. The subtle tension lingered in the air, a reminder of the biases people carried even without direct confrontation. Moments later, the park's calm was interrupted once more. A group of teenagers on bikes came weaving through the trees, their loud laughter cutting through the tranquil atmosphere. One of the boys, noticing Michael sitting alone on the bench, skidded to a stop and motioned for his friends to join him. "Check this out," he called with a mischievous grin, pointing toward Michael. The group clustered around the bench, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mischief. "Yo, old man," one of the boys said mockingly. "What's your deal? Lose your job or something?" Michael remained calm, his gaze steady but uninterested. "Just sitting here," he replied simply. Another boy pulled out his phone, holding it up to record. "Say something for the camera," he taunted. "Give us your life story." Michael's voice remained calm, but there was a subtle edge to it. "You should move on." Michael's voice carried an authority that silenced the group. "You should get going," he said, his gaze steady. "This isn't a place for games." The teenagers hesitated, their laughter faltering as they exchanged uncertain glances. There was something in his tone, quiet but commanding, that made them second-guess their decision to stick around. Before they could decide whether to leave or push further, the unmistakable sound of a police cruiser pulling up nearby drew their attention. Officer Evans stepped out first, his eyes immediately locking onto the group. "What's going on here?" he called, his tone sharp and demanding. The teenagers froze for a moment before scattering like startled birds, their bikes kicking up small clouds of dust as they sped off into the trees. Evans barely spared them a second glance, his focus zeroed in on Michael once again. "You again," he said, striding toward the bench. "Couldn't find another spot to loiter, huh?" Michael didn't move, his posture remaining relaxed as he met Evans' gaze. "Didn't realize sitting on a bench counted as loitering," he replied calmly. Evans' frustration bubbled over, his jaw tightening as he leaned in slightly. "Don't play games with me. What's your deal, Carter? Why are you still here?" The teenagers scattered like leaves in the wind, their bikes kicking up dust as they pedaled away. Officer Evans barely spared them a glance, his focus laser-sharp and zeroed in on Michael, still seated calmly on the bench. "You again," Evans said, striding toward him, his tone sharp and accusatory. "Couldn't find another park to loiter in?" Michael didn't move. His posture was as relaxed as ever, his expression unreadable. "Is sitting on a bench against the law now?" he asked, his tone even and measured. Evans' frustration bubbled beneath the surface, his jaw tightening. "You've got a smart mouth," he said, stopping a few feet away. His hand hovered near the baton at his hip, a subtle yet unmistakable gesture. Michael met his gaze with unwavering calm. "I wasn't aware that using my mouth made me suspicious," he replied. His tone was polite, but the underlying message was clear. Officer Harris, who had been trailing behind, sighed deeply and stepped forward. "Danny, we've done this already," he said, his voice edged with exasperation. "Let it go." But Evans ignored him, his eyes locked on Michael. "What's your deal, huh?" he pressed, leaning in slightly. "People don't just sit around like this unless they're up to something." Officer Evans stood just a few feet away, his frustration evident. "I don't like smart mouths," he muttered. "Good thing I'm not here to make friends," Michael replied evenly, his calm demeanor unwavering. At that moment, Officer Harris joined his partner, his expression one of mild annoyance. He glanced between the two men and sighed heavily. "What's going on here?" Harris asked, his tone edged with fatigue. "Why are we back?" "I don't trust him," Evans said sharply, his gaze never leaving Michael. "He's up to something." Harris shook his head, clearly exasperated. "He's sitting on a bench, Danny. Let it go." But Evans wasn't listening. His instincts screamed that there was more to Michael than met the eye. He stepped closer, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. "What's in the bag?" he demanded. Michael tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Lunch?" he said simply. "Prove it," Evans snapped, his tone laced with suspicion. Michael tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Lunch," he repeated. "Prove it," Officer Evans snapped. Michael raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Calmly, he picked up the crumpled paper bag and held it out, allowing Evans to peer inside. The officer frowned, his suspicion only deepening as he rummaged through the contents. A half-eaten apple, a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and a bottle of water. "You've got something else on you," Evans insisted, his tone sharp. "No one just sits here this casually unless they're hiding something." Michael set the bag down, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. "I've got nothing to hide," he said, his voice calm. "But if you're looking for trouble, I'm not the one you'll find it with." Evans clenched his jaw, clearly irritated by Michael's composure. The tension hung thick in the air as the two locked eyes, each silently challenging the other. Officer Harris sighed, shaking his head. "Let it go," he said to Evans, his tone firm but weary. "We've got better things to do." But Evans hesitated, his instinct screaming that there was more to Michael than met the eye. He didn't know what it was, but he was determined to find out. His jaw tightened as he stared at Michael, who remained seated on the bench, calm and composed. The weight of Evans's suspicion pressed heavily on the encounter, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, Harris had already turned and was heading back toward the cruiser, clearly ready to move on. Yet Evans couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He wasn't ready to let it go. There was something about Michael, his calm demeanor, his unshakable composure, that gnawed at Evans. It felt as though Michael was playing a game, one that Evans wasn't sure he could win. Michael's unshakable composure set Evans on edge. It was like the man was playing a game, and Evans hated the feeling that he might be losing. His frustration finally boiled over. "You're awfully calm for someone getting this much attention," Evans said, his voice low and sharp. "Most people in your situation would be a little more nervous." Michael didn't flinch. His tone remained steady as he responded, "Most people aren't breaking any laws. Are you saying I should be nervous?" The response only seemed to irritate Evans further. He stepped closer, his hand still resting on the baton at his hip. "I'm saying you're acting like you've got nothing to lose," he said, his voice heavy with suspicion. Michael tilted his head slightly, meeting Evans's gaze directly. "And if I do?" he asked, his tone as calm as ever but with a subtle edge of defiance. "You've got nothing to lose," Evans said, his voice dripping with suspicion. "And that makes me wonder what you're hiding." Michael remained unbothered, his voice even and calm. "I've got nothing to hide," he replied. "You've searched me. You've searched my bag. If you're still looking for something, that's on you." Nearby, Harris stood a few feet away with one hand resting on the cruiser door. He sighed heavily, his frustration evident. "Come on, Danny," he called to his partner. "He's not doing anything. Let's move on." But Evans wasn't ready to back down. He ignored Harris, his eyes narrowing as he studied Michael's relaxed demeanor. "You've got an answer for everything, don't you?" Evans muttered, his tone laced with irritation. Michael met his gaze steadily, his calm composure an unspoken challenge. "I didn't realize answering questions was a crime," he said, the hint of a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "You think you're smarter than me," Evans said, his irritation clear in his voice. Michael tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I'm not trying to prove anything," he replied calmly. "I'm just sitting on a bench." Evans took another step closer, his frustration evident in the way his jaw tightened. The tension between the two men grew thicker with each passing moment. "You think you're clever," Evans muttered, his voice low. "You think you can just sit here and make me look like an idiot?" Michael's response was soft but sharp, cutting through the heated exchange like a knife. "I think you're making yourself look that way," he said, his calm tone carrying an edge that stung. Harris, who had been watching the exchange from a few steps away, stiffened. He turned back toward the scene and raised his voice. "Enough," he said firmly, stepping between Evans and Michael. "We're not doing this." Harris stood firmly between his partner and Michael, his voice resolute. "We're done here," he said. "Let's go." But Evans wasn't ready to back down. "No, we're not," he snapped, his frustration boiling over. "This guy's playing us. I can feel it." "Feel it all you want," Harris replied sharply, his patience wearing thin. "You don't have anything on him. Leave it alone." For a moment, it looked as though Evans might argue further, his face flushed with anger and humiliation, his hand still hovering near his baton. But after a tense pause, he finally stepped back, his jaw clenched tightly. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, his hand reluctantly dropping from his baton. "We go." With one last glare toward Michael, Evans turned and began walking back toward the cruiser, his frustration palpable in every step. Michael sat silently on the bench, watching as the officers turned and walked back toward their cruiser. His expression remained unreadable, calm, and collected. As Evans reached the car, he paused, glancing back over his shoulder. For a brief moment, his eyes met Michael's. In that instant, an unspoken challenge seemed to pass between them, an exchange of defiance without a single word spoken. Inside the cruiser, Harris shook his head as he started the engine. "You've got to let this stuff go," he said, his tone tired. "It's not worth the trouble." "It's not about trouble," Evans muttered, staring out the window, his frustration still simmering. "It's about respect. That guy—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening as his thoughts churned. "He thinks he's untouchable. He's not," Evans muttered, his voice low and resolute. Harris sighed deeply, pulling the cruiser onto Central Park's main road. "Just let it go, Danny," he said. "We've got better things to do." But Evans couldn't let it go. His mind raced with endless possibilities, each one more frustrating than the last. Who was this guy? He wondered. Why did he act like he had nothing to fear? Why did it feel like he was hiding something, even though there was no evidence to prove it? Back on the bench, Michael remained composed, his expression unreadable as he watched the cruiser disappear around the corner. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small, sleek device. A faint, knowing smile flickered across his face as he turned it over in his hands. Michael reached into the paper bag beside him, pulling out the sandwich he had started earlier. As he unwrapped it, his gaze flicked briefly toward a cluster of trees nearby. There, a man in a gray hoodie stood, watching him intently. The man in the hoodie stepped forward, his movements cautious but deliberate. He stopped a few feet from the bench, glancing around to make sure they weren't being observed. "How's it going?" he asked, his voice low. Michael took a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully before replying. "About as expected," he said calmly. "They're suspicious, but they haven't figured anything out yet," Michael continued, his tone calm and steady. The man in the gray hoodie nodded, his hands tucked into his pockets. "Think they'll come back?" he asked. "They always do," Michael said with a faint smile, his lips curving into a subtle expression of confidence. "Curiosity gets the better of them." The man hesitated, his brow furrowing slightly. "You sure about this? You're pushing them pretty hard." "That's the point," Michael replied, his voice unwavering. "I want to see how far they'll go." Nearby, a jogger paused to tie their shoe, their eyes flicking momentarily toward the two men before continuing on their way. The man in the hoodie shifted slightly, still uneasy, but clearly trusting Michael's judgment. The man in the hoodie stepped back, his posture tense. "Just be careful," he said quietly. "If this goes sideways—" "It won't," Michael interrupted, his voice calm but filled with quiet authority that left no room for argument. "I've got this." The man in the hoodie nodded reluctantly and retreated back into the shadows of the trees. Michael took another deliberate bite of his sandwich, his gaze returning to the path ahead. It didn't take long for the familiar hum of the police cruiser to reach his ears again. Officer Martinez was back. The sound of the cruiser grew louder, blending with the rustling leaves and distant chatter of the park. Amid the rustling leaves and distant chatter of Central Park, Michael didn't flinch. His posture remained relaxed as he finished the last bite of his sandwich. The now empty paper bag rested neatly beside him, a quiet signal of nonchalance. But behind this calm demeanor lay a sharp, unshakable awareness evident in his eyes. The cruiser rolled to a stop nearby, its brakes screeching softly. Officer Martinez stepped out of the vehicle before it had even fully halted. His steps were brisk and purposeful, the frustration on his face impossible to miss. Behind him, Officer Harris followed at a slower pace, his expression weighed down by unease. "You again?" Martinez snapped, his tone sharp as he approached Michael. Martinez's sharp tone cut through the ambient park noises. His gaze flicked from the crumpled, empty paper bag back to Michael's calm, unreadable face. "Didn't we just have this conversation?" Martinez demanded, frustration seeping through his words. Michael looked up, his expression steady and neutral. "We did," he replied evenly, "but I didn't realize sitting on a bench was grounds for a second visit." "Don't get smart with me," Martinez snapped, his hand moving instinctively to rest on his baton. "You're still here, still acting suspicious. I don't know what your game is, but I'm going to find out." Before the tension could escalate further, Harris stepped forward, raising a hand to his partner. "What are you doing, Danny?" he asked, his voice low but firm, clearly attempting to defuse the situation. Harris kept his voice calm but firm as he repeated, "We already cleared him, Danny. Let it go." But Martinez shook his head, his gaze locked unwaveringly on Michael. "He's up to something. I can feel it." Harris sighed, his tone tinged with frustration and exasperation. "That's not how the law works, Danny. You can't just hassle someone because you feel like it." Martinez gestured emphatically toward Michael, his words clipped. "Then why is he still here? Why hasn't he left? Normal people don't hang around like this." Michael, still seated, tilted his head slightly. His voice was calm but carried a deliberate edge. "Normal people?" he repeated softly. "And what exactly does that mean?" Martinez's jaw tightened at the challenge, his irritation bubbling just below the surface as the tension between the three grew even thicker. Martinez took another deliberate step forward, his tone sharp as he said, "It means people who don't make a habit of sitting around parks waiting for attention." Michael's expression didn't waver as he replied in a calm, unbothered tone. "Maybe I just like the view," he said. "Or maybe I don't feel like being rushed out of a public space for no reason." Officer Higgins let out a deep sigh, raising a hand to rub his temple. He cast a wary glance at Martinez, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Danny, you're escalating this for no reason," he said firmly. "Let it go." But Martinez ignored him. His frustration was visible in the tightness of his jaw and the sharp gestures he made toward Michael. "If he's got nothing to hide," Martinez muttered, his voice taut, "then he won't mind." Martinez's frustration boiled over, and his words came fast. "Answering a few more questions," he insisted, his voice firm. Michael tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "What do you want to know?" he asked calmly. "Why are you here?" Martinez demanded. "Why this park? Why this bench?" Michael leaned back a little, his tone measured and unfazed. "Do I need a reason?" he asked. "I wasn't aware public spaces came with prerequisites." Martinez's eyes narrowed, his suspicion deepening. "What's your deal?" he said, his voice sharp. "You're too calm, too calculated. People don't just sit like this unless they're planning something." Michael raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Planning what?" he asked. "A picnic? A peaceful afternoon? You tell me what crime I'm committing, and I'll tell you why I'm here." Officer Higgins stepped forward again, his patience clearly wearing thin. "That's enough," he said, his tone firm. "You've got nothing. Nothing. Let's move on." But Officer Martinez refused to back down. He reached for his radio, his thumb pressing the button as he spoke into it with determination. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I need a record check on an individual named Calvin Broaddus. ID provided earlier." Michael raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. His expression was unreadable as he watched Martinez intently. The radio crackled to life in response, the dispatcher's voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by." Higgins sighed audibly, rubbing his temples in frustration. "You're making this worse, Danny," he muttered under his breath. The radio crackled faintly again, confirming, "Copy that, Unit 12. Stand by." Officer Higgins groaned, throwing up his hands in frustration. "You're making this into something it's not," he muttered, his tone laced with exhaustion. "This is going to come back on us." "Then he shouldn't have anything to worry about," Martinez retorted, his gaze fixed on Michael. "If he's clean, he's clean." Michael shifted slightly on the bench, leaning back as he folded his arms across his chest. "You're very determined," he remarked, his voice calm but with a faint trace of amusement. "It's almost flattering." "Don't try to play me," Martinez snapped, his tone sharp and unyielding. "You're not as clever as you think you are." Michael tilted his head slightly, his gaze unflinching. "Maybe not," he replied smoothly, but I don't need to be. The radio crackled once more, cutting through the tense silence. Unit 12, no records found under the name Calvin Broadus matching the provided ID, the dispatcher reported. Martinez stiffened, his hand tightening on the radio. What do you mean, no records? He demanded, his tone sharp. Exactly what it sounds like, the dispatcher replied, their voice calm but firm. No matches in the system. Either the ID is fake or there's an error in the database. Officer Higgins's face darkened as he turned to his partner, his patience clearly fraying. That's enough, he said sharply. We're not turning this into a witch hunt. Let it go. But Martinez wasn't ready to let go. His suspicion, already burning, now flared into full-blown determination. Martinez's suspicion only deepened, his frustration bubbling over into barely concealed anger. He's lying, he said sharply, pointing at Snoop on the bench. That ID is fake, and he knows it. Snoop's gaze remained calm, though there was a flicker of something, amusement perhaps, in his eyes. If that's true, he said evenly, then why didn't you spot it earlier? Martinez opened his mouth to respond, but Higgins cut him off before he could speak. We're done here, Higgins said firmly, grabbing his partner's arm and steering him toward the cruiser. Let it go before you make this worse. Martinez hesitated for a moment, his jaw clenched tightly, but he finally allowed himself to be led away. His eyes, however, never left Snoop, burning with unresolved suspicion as they returned to the cruiser. Officer Martinez reluctantly allowed himself to be led away, but his glare remained fixed on Snoop as they returned to the car. This isn't over, he muttered under his breath, slamming the door behind him. Snoop watched the cruiser pull away, his expression unreadable. Once again, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small device that fit neatly into the palm of his hand. As he turned it over, a faint smirk crossed his lips. The game was unfolding exactly as he'd expected. Minutes later, the familiar rumble of the cruiser's engine echoed through the park again. The vehicle circled back to the parking lot, Officer Martinez once again gripping the wheel tightly. His eyes scanned the area, zeroing in on Snoop still seated on the same bench, as calm and unbothered as before. Let me know when you'd like the continuation. As the police cruiser rolled to a stop near the park bench, Martinez was out of the car before it had completely halted. His steps were quick, deliberate, and charged with frustration. Officer Higgins followed reluctantly, his expression exasperated. You're still here, Martinez barked, his tone sharp as his eyes locked onto Snoop. Didn't we already tell you to move along? Snoop didn't move. He leaned back slightly, his posture relaxed but commanding. I didn't realize sitting on a bench was grounds for an eviction, he replied evenly. Don't get smart with me, Martinez snapped, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. You're still here, still acting suspicious. I don't know what your game is, but I'm going to find out. Higgins stepped in, raising a hand to his partner. Danny, enough, he said, his voice firm but calm. He's not doing anything wrong. He's hiding something, Martinez retorted, not taking his eyes off Snoop. I know it. Martinez took another step closer, his voice dropping low but brimming with tension. You're too calm, he accused. Most people in your situation would have gotten nervous or left by now. What are you hiding? Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady but detached. Most people aren't breaking any laws, he said simply. Are you suggesting I should feel nervous because of your presence? Martinez's jaw tightened. I'm saying you're acting like you've got nothing to lose, and that makes me wonder what you're trying to pull. Higgins sighed audibly, clearly losing patience. Danny, he's not breaking any laws. Let it go. But Martinez wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet, he muttered, his eyes narrowing as if trying to pierce through Snoop's calm demeanor. But I'll figure it out. The paper bag rested neatly against Snoop's leg, its emptiness signaling he had finished eating. He looked up as the officers approached, his expression calm and unreadable. You boys missed me already? Snoop asked, his tone even but laced with a faint hint of amusement. Martinez stiffened, his frustration boiling over. "We're not done with you yet," he said sharply, stepping closer. "That ID you gave us, it doesn't exist. Care to explain?" Snoop raised an eyebrow, his gaze steady. "Maybe your system's broken," he replied coolly. "Or maybe you're just looking for something that's not there." "Don't get smart with me," Martinez snapped, his hand twitching near his baton. His eyes burned with suspicion as he leaned forward slightly, trying to impose his authority. "I know you're hiding something." Snoop's calm demeanor didn't waver. "I've already told you everything I need to," he said. "If your system can't confirm it, that's not my problem." Higgins, standing slightly behind Martinez, sighed heavily and rubbed his temple. "Danny, you're making this into something it doesn't need to be," he said, his voice tired. "Let's just move on." Martinez ignored him, his frustration bubbling over into barely concealed anger. "I don't like being lied to," he said, his tone sharp. "And I don't like people thinking they can get away with it." "Then maybe you should stop looking for lies where there aren't any," Snoop replied, his tone measured but firm. Officer Martinez snapped, "I know a fake when I see one." His voice was sharp, frustration evident in his tone. Officer Higgins stepped in, trying to de-escalate the situation. His tone was more measured but firm. "We're giving you a chance to come clean," he said. "If there's something you need to tell us, now's the time." Snoop leaned back slightly on the bench, his posture still relaxed, almost unaffected by the tension around him. He studied the two officers with a calm and calculated gaze. "What exactly do you think I'm hiding?" he asked, his tone laced with curiosity. "A secret identity? A criminal record? Or maybe a sinister plan to overthrow the local park bench economy?" Officer Higgins pressed a hand to his temple, clearly exhausted by the exchange and the direction it was heading. "Look," he said, his voice tinged with exasperation. "We're not here to play games. Just give us the truth." Snoop's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. His eyes shifted toward Officer Martinez, whose face was now red with irritation. "The truth?" Snoop repeated slowly, his voice even. "The truth is, I'm just sitting on a bench. You've already searched me, questioned me, and even tried to make me leave. What else are you looking for?" Officer Martinez took a step closer, his hand once again resting on the baton at his hip. "You're too calm," he said sharply. "People don't just sit here like this unless they're planning something." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Planning what?" he asked, his voice measured and deliberate. "A picnic? A peaceful afternoon in the park? You tell me, officer." The tension between the three men was palpable, hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. Martinez's jaw tightened as he tried to form a response, but it was clear that Snoop's unshakable composure was getting under his skin. Higgins, meanwhile, sighed heavily, his patience clearly wearing thin. "That's enough," Higgins said firmly, stepping between his partner and Snoop. "We've got nothing to go on. Let's move on before this turns into something it doesn't need to be." But Martinez wasn't ready to back down. His eyes stayed locked on Snoop as he muttered, "I don't trust him. There's something off about this guy." Snoop remained silent, his calm demeanor unbroken. Instead, he leaned back against the bench and folded his arms, waiting to see what the officers would do next. The park was quiet again, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of children's laughter echoed faintly, a stark contrast to the charged atmosphere surrounding the bench. Martinez clenched his fists, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Higgins, sensing the brewing storm, placed a firm hand on his partner's shoulder and whispered, "Let it go, Danny. He's not worth it." For a moment, Martinez hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to keep pressing, to uncover whatever it was that Snoop was hiding. But Higgins' words, combined with the growing sense that they were drawing unwanted attention from passers-by, finally made him relent, at least for now. "Fine," Martinez said through gritted teeth, his glare still fixed on Snoop. "But this isn't over." With that, the two officers turned and began walking back toward their cruiser. Snoop watched them leave, his expression unreadable, as if he were already several steps ahead in whatever game was unfolding. Officer Higgins exchanged a wary look with Martinez, then turned back to Snoop. "You're not making this easier on yourself," he said, his tone laced with frustration. "If you've got a reason for being here, just tell us. Otherwise, my partner's not going to let this go. I think we both know that's true." Snoop nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to Officer Martinez, who was now visibly tense. "You've made up your mind about me, haven't you?" Snoop said calmly, his voice steady and deliberate. "Nothing I say is going to change that." Martinez took another step closer, his hand gripping the baton at his hip. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice low and tense, as though trying to suppress the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You think you can just sit there, acting like you're better than us?" Snoop's expression didn't change. His calm gaze met Martinez's fiery glare head-on. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he replied evenly. "But I do think you've got something to prove." The words landed like a slap, and Martinez's jaw tightened. He leaned in slightly, his face now inches from Snoop's. "You think this is a game?" he growled. "You think you can sit here and make me look like a fool?" Snoop tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but with an edge that cut deep. "I think you're doing a fine job of that all by yourself," he said. Officer Higgins stepped between them, his patience clearly at its limit. "Enough," he said firmly, placing a hand on Martinez's chest to push him back. "We're done here." Martinez, his face flushed with anger, resisted for a moment but eventually relented, stepping back reluctantly. "This guy's playing us," he muttered under his breath. Higgins shot him a sharp look. "Let it go, Danny," he said. "He's not breaking any laws. We're not doing this." Martinez's shoulders tensed, his frustration palpable as he stared at Snoop one last time. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice laced with a simmering rage. Snoop leaned back against the bench, his posture relaxed, as if the entire encounter had left him unaffected. "Have a nice day, officers," he said, his tone calm, but with a faint undercurrent of defiance. The officers turned and walked away, Higgins clearly trying to calm his partner as they made their way back to the cruiser. Snoop watched them go, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady as though he were already preparing for the next move in the unspoken battle. Officer Higgins exchanged a wary look with Martinez, then turned back to Snoop. "You're not making this easier on yourself," he said, his tone laced with frustration. "If you've got a reason for being here, just tell us. Otherwise, my partner's not going to let this go. I think we both know that's true." Snoop nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to Officer Martinez, who was now visibly tense. "You've made up your mind about me, haven't you?" Snoop said calmly, his voice steady and deliberate. "Nothing I say is going to change that." Martinez took another step closer, his hand gripping the baton at his hip. "You think you're clever," he said, his voice low and tense, as though trying to suppress the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "You think you can just sit there acting like you're better than us?" Snoop's expression didn't change. His calm gaze met Martinez's fiery glare head-on. "I don't think I'm better than anyone," he replied evenly. "But I do think you've got something to prove." The words landed like a slap, and Martinez's jaw tightened. He leaned in slightly, his face now inches from Snoop's. "You think this is a game?" he growled. "You think you can sit here and make me look like a fool?" Snoop tilted his head slightly, his voice calm but with an edge that cut deep. "I think you're doing a fine job of that all by yourself," he said. Officer Higgins stepped between them, his patience clearly at its limit. "Enough," he said firmly, placing a hand on Martinez's chest to push him back. "We're done here." Martinez, his face flushed with anger, resisted for a moment, but eventually relented, stepping back reluctantly. "This guy's playing us," he muttered under his breath. Higgins shot him a sharp look. Let it go, Danny, he said. He's not breaking any laws. We're not doing this. Martinez's shoulders tensed, his frustration palpable as he stared at Snoop one last time. This isn't over, he said quietly, his voice laced with a simmering rage. Snoop leaned back against the bench, his posture relaxed, as if the entire encounter had left him unaffected. Have a nice day, officers, he said, his tone calm but with a faint undercurrent of defiance. The officers turned and walked away, Higgins clearly trying to calm his partner as they made their way back to the cruiser. Snoop watched them go, his expression unreadable, his gaze steady as though he were already preparing for the next move in the unspoken battle. Snoop's calm demeanor seemed to fan the flames of Martinez's anger. Martinez's face turned red, his frustration boiling over as he loomed even closer. "You think this is a game?" he demanded, his voice low but seething with rage. "You think you can just sit there and make me look like a fool?" Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression unbothered. "I think you're doing a fine job of that on your own," he replied, his tone sharp but calm, like a knife cutting through the tension. Martinez's hand twitched, his grip tightening on the baton at his hip. But before he could do or say anything else, Officer Higgins intervened. He grabbed Martinez's arm and pulled him back firmly. "Enough," Higgins said, his voice steady but commanding. "We're not doing this." Martinez resisted for a brief moment, his jaw tightening as he glared at Snoop. "He's taunting us," he muttered, his voice almost a growl. Higgins kept a firm grip on his partner's arm, his expression one of weary authority. "You're escalating this for no reason," he said. "Let it go. Now." Martinez finally took a step back, though his eyes never left Snoop. His expression was a storm of anger and humiliation, but he didn't argue further. Snoop remained seated, his posture as relaxed as ever, though his gaze followed the two officers closely. "Smart choice," he said quietly, the faintest hint of a smirk playing on his lips. Martinez turned away sharply, muttering under his breath as he walked back toward the cruiser. Higgins followed, throwing a glance over his shoulder at Snoop. It was a look that was equal parts frustration and resignation, as though he knew this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. Snoop leaned back against the bench, his eyes scanning the park. The tension in the air began to dissipate, but an undercurrent of unease remained. He had no doubt that this was far from over. "We're not doing this," Officer Higgins repeated firmly, stepping between Martinez and Snoop to de-escalate the situation. However, Martinez wasn't ready to back down. His frustration bubbled to the surface, and he gestured toward Snoop, his tone sharp. "He's hiding something," Martinez snapped. "I know it. He's too calm, too confident. Nobody acts like that unless they've got something to hide." Higgins let out a heavy sigh, his patience wearing thin. "Even if he is," Higgins replied, his tone laced with exasperation, "it's not our job to harass him until we find something. We don't have probable cause. Drop it." Martinez's face turned red with indignation, and his voice rose, nearly shouting, "Probable cause? How about a fake ID? How about refusing to leave when we've asked?" Higgins turned to his partner, his expression firm. "A public park isn't private property, Danny," he said, his tone growing sharper. "He doesn't have to leave just because you don't like the way he looks or acts. That's not how this works." Martinez clenched his fists, his gaze fixed on Snoop, who continued to sit calmly, observing the exchange with quiet interest. "I'm not letting this go," Martinez muttered. "There's something wrong here. I can feel it." "Feeling isn't enough," Higgins countered. "Let it go. We're not doing this." Snoop remained seated, his calm demeanor unchanged. He watched the officers argue with a faintly amused expression, as though he were watching a scene in a play. Martinez finally stepped back, though his jaw was tight, and his hand lingered near the baton at his hip. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. "Yes, it is," Higgins replied, his voice heavy with finality. "Let's go." With a sharp turn, Higgins began walking back to the cruiser, leaving Martinez no choice but to follow. But the younger officer's frustration and suspicion were far from extinguished, and he cast one last glare at Snoop over his shoulder. Snoop leaned back on the bench, his gaze following the officers as they retreated. His expression betrayed nothing, but the tension in his posture hinted that he was ready for whatever was coming next. "It's a public park," Officer Higgins said firmly, his tone sharp and resolute. "He doesn't have to leave unless he's breaking the law, and so far he hasn't." On the bench, Snoop watched the exchange silently, his expression calm but observant. There was an air of quiet calculation about him, as though he were taking mental notes, cataloging every word and movement from the officers. It was as if this entire encounter were part of a larger plan that only he fully understood. Officer Martinez's frustration boiled over. He pointed a finger at Snoop, his voice low and laced with venom. "You're going to regret this," he muttered. "Whatever you're up to, I'll figure it out." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and unflinching. His lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "I'm sure you will," he replied evenly, his tone calm, but with an edge that only added to Martinez's irritation. Martinez's jaw tightened, but before he could say another word, Higgins placed a firm hand on his shoulder, a silent but clear signal to back off. "We're done here, Danny," Higgins said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Let's go." Martinez hesitated, his hand still hovering near his baton, but eventually he turned and walked back toward the cruiser. His steps were stiff, his frustration evident in every movement. Higgins followed close behind, shaking his head slightly as if questioning how things had escalated this far. Snoop remained seated, his posture relaxed as he watched the officers retreat. Once they were out of earshot, his faint smile widened ever so slightly, and he leaned back against the bench, his hands resting casually on his lap. Whatever tension lingered in the air seemed to dissipate, but the sense of something unfinished hung over the scene. The officers climbed into the cruiser, Martinez slamming his door shut with unnecessary force. "He's playing us," Martinez growled, gripping the steering wheel tightly as they pulled away. Higgins sighed, rubbing his temple as he looked out the window. "Maybe," he replied quietly, "or maybe you're just looking for something that isn't there." Snoop watched the cruiser disappear down the park's path, his calm demeanor unchanged. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small device and turning it over in his hands. His faint smile lingered as he whispered to himself, "The game's just getting started." "I'm sure you will," Snoop said calmly, his lips curling into a faint smirk. "Good luck with that." The words hung in the air like a subtle but sharp challenge, their calm defiance only fueling Officer Martinez's frustration. His jaw tightened as he turned abruptly, storming back to the cruiser without another word. His partner, Officer Higgins, followed reluctantly, his expression one of weariness. As they climbed into the cruiser and drove away, Martinez's thoughts raced, his grip tightening on the wheel. His frustration was palpable, and the words Snoop had left him with echoed in his mind. "He's playing us," Martinez muttered under his breath, his knuckles white as he clutched the steering wheel. Higgins sighed heavily, leaning his head back against the seat. "Or maybe," he said tiredly, "you're just reading too much into this. Not everyone sitting on a park bench is hiding something, Danny." But Martinez wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on the road ahead, though his mind was still back at the bench. He replayed every moment of their encounter, analyzing Snoop's calm demeanor, his measured words, and his unshakable composure. It all felt too deliberate, too calculated. "No," Martinez said firmly, his voice low but resolute. "There's more to this guy. I know it." Higgins glanced at him but didn't respond. He had seen Martinez like this before, fixated, stubborn, unwilling to let something go. It was an exhausting trait, but one Higgins had learned to tolerate. As the cruiser made its way through the winding streets surrounding the park, Martinez's mind was already forming a plan. He was determined to uncover whatever Snoop was hiding, no matter how long it took or how many rules he had to bend. "I'll figure it out," Martinez muttered, more to himself than to his partner. His determination was clear, and the faint edge in his voice made Higgins uneasy. "You better be careful," Higgins said after a long pause. "If you push too hard, this could backfire." Martinez didn't respond. His focus remained unbroken, his thoughts consumed by the mysterious man on the bench. Back at the park, Snoop sat quietly, watching the path where the cruiser had disappeared. His calm expression remained, but there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. He leaned back against the bench, pulling the hood of his jacket up slightly to shield his face from the fading sunlight. "Let's see how far they'll go," Snoop murmured to himself, a faint smile crossing his lips as he settled in to wait for what was sure to come next. Officer Martinez's resolve was unshaken. He was determined to uncover the truth about Snoop on the bench, no matter what it took. His thoughts were consumed by every moment of their interaction, every word, every calm look, every calculated move that Snoop had made. Back at Central Park, Snoop sat on the weathered bench, watching as the police cruiser disappeared into the distance. His calm demeanor remained intact, completely unshaken by the heated exchange. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small device. Turning it over in his hands, a faint smile played on his lips, a smile that hinted at something more, an understanding that the game was far from over. The tension in the park lingered in the air, almost tangible, as Snoop settled back into his seat. He glanced around casually, his expression unreadable but purposeful, as though he were anticipating what was to come. Not long after, the familiar figure of Officer Martinez emerged once again, this time walking toward the bench alone. His movements were brisk, his body language taut with determination. It was clear that his partner, Higgins, had finally had enough and refused to partake in what he called an unnecessary vendetta. Martinez didn't care. This wasn't about protocol anymore. It was personal. As Martinez approached, Snoop noticed him immediately, but didn't react. He sat calmly, his hands resting on his lap, the small device now tucked back into his pocket. His gaze remained steady, following Martinez's every step. "You've got some nerve," Martinez said, his voice low and tense as he stopped a few feet from the bench. "Sitting here like you own the place." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "It's a public park," he replied evenly. "Nobody owns it." "You know what I mean," Martinez snapped, his frustration boiling over. "You've been playing games with me all day and I'm done. You're going to tell me who you really are, or I'll make sure you regret it." Snoop's lips curled into a faint smile, the kind that only seemed to fuel Martinez's anger. "You really want to know who I am?" Snoop asked, his tone calm but carrying a quiet authority. Martinez's hand rested on the baton at his hip, his stance stiff as he glared at Snoop. "Enough with the smart remarks," he growled. "Let's see some real ID this time. No tricks, no fake names, just the truth." Snoop reached into his coat pocket slowly, his movements deliberate. Martinez tensed, his grip on the baton tightening as he prepared for anything. But instead of a weapon or another questionable ID, Snoop pulled out a sleek black smartphone. Its polished surface caught the fading sunlight as he held it up for Martinez to see. "Here's the thing," Snoop said, his voice steady but sharp. "I don't need to prove anything to you, but since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll give it to you." Martinez's brow furrowed as Snoop tapped the screen a few times, pulling up a video. He held the phone up, and the footage began to play. What Martinez saw made his blood run cold. The video was a crystal-clear recording of their earlier interactions. Every word, every action, and every tense moment had been captured in stunning detail. The audio was flawless, leaving no room for misinterpretation. "What is this?" Martinez demanded, his voice rising in a mix of panic and anger. "This," Snoop said calmly, "is a live stream. It's been running all day. Every word you've said, every move you've made, it's all been broadcast to millions of people." Martinez's face went pale, his grip on his baton faltering. What are you talking about?" Snoop stood slowly, his full height imposing as he faced Martinez. His expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable intensity in his eyes. "I'm not Calvin Broadus," he said, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "I'm Michael Carter." Martinez blinked, his mind reeling as he tried to process the revelation. "Michael Carter," he stammered. "You're kidding me." "I never kid about things like this," Snoop replied, his tone even but firm. "This was an experiment, to see how people like you treat those you perceive as powerless." Martinez's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The realization hit him like a freight train, the weight of his actions crashing down all at once. "You set me up," Martinez finally managed to say, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and panic. "I didn't set you up," Snoop replied evenly. "I gave you a choice. Every action you took, every word you said, that was all you. I just observed." Martinez's face flushed red, his frustration boiling over. "You had no right," he spat. "You had no right to do this." "I had every right," Snoop said calmly, his gaze unwavering. "You're a public servant, sworn to protect and serve. But instead of doing your job, you chose to harass someone you thought was beneath you." Martinez took a step back, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out of the situation. "You can't use this," he said, his voice rising. "This is entrapment. It's illegal." Snoop's expression didn't waver. "It's not entrapment," he said. "I didn't force you to do anything. And as for legality, my lawyers would be happy to explain why you don't have a case." For Officer Martinez, this wasn't about an unnecessary vendetta, as his partner had called it. This was about control. It was about getting to the bottom of whatever Snoop, Michael Carter, was hiding. Determined to uncover the truth, Martinez strode toward the bench with renewed intensity, his hand resting on the baton at his hip. Every step felt calculated, his mind rehearsing his next move over and over. Snoop remained where he was, seated calmly on the bench. His hood was now pushed back completely, revealing more of his face. The relaxed expression he wore contrasted sharply with the sharpness in his eyes, an intensity that unsettled Martinez even more. "You've got some nerve," Martinez said as he came to a stop a few feet away, his voice low and filled with tension. "Sitting here like you own the place." Snoop looked up at him slowly, his gaze calm yet penetrating. "It's a public park," he replied evenly. "Nobody owns it." "You know what I mean," Martinez snapped, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "You've been playing games with me all day and I'm done. You're going to tell me who you really are or I'll make sure you regret it." Snoop tilted his head slightly, as if contemplating the officer's words. Then a faint smile curved across his lips. "You really want to know who I am?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "Enough with the smart remarks," Martinez barked, his hand tightening on his baton. "Let's see some real ID this time. No tricks, no fake names, just the truth." Snoop reached into his coat pocket slowly, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Martinez tensed, his body coiling like a spring, ready to react at the slightest sign of a threat. But instead of pulling out another questionable ID or anything threatening, Snoop produced his sleek black smartphone. The polished surface gleamed under the sunlight as he held it up. "Here's the thing," Snoop said, his voice steady and calm. "I don't need to prove anything to you. But since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll give it to you." Martinez's brow furrowed as Snoop tapped the screen a few times, his fingers moving with precision. A video began to play, the bright screen illuminating Snoop's composed face. Martinez leaned in slightly, his curiosity momentarily overriding his frustration. What he saw made his breath catch. It was footage, crystal clear, of their earlier interactions. Every word Martinez had spoken, every gesture, every moment of frustration and aggression was captured in excruciating detail. The audio was flawless, leaving no room for doubt or misinterpretation. What is this?" Martinez demanded, his voice rising with a mixture of anger and panic. "This," Snoop said, his tone unshaken, "is a live stream. It's been running all day. Every word you've said, every move you've made, it's all been broadcast to millions of people." Martinez's face went pale, his hand dropping from his baton as his grip faltered. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling. Snoop stood up slowly, his full height towering over the officer. His calm expression didn't waver, but there was an undeniable strength in his posture. "I'm not Calvin Broadus," Snoop said, his voice sharp and cutting. "I'm Michael Carter. And today, I've been conducting an experiment to see how people in power treat those they think are powerless." Martinez stared at him, stunned, the realization hitting him like a ton of bricks. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. His mind was racing, trying to process the revelation while grappling with the implications of being caught in such a public way. "You set me up," Martinez finally managed to say, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. "I didn't set you up," Snoop replied calmly, his gaze unwavering. "I gave you a choice. Every action you took, every word you said, that was all you. I just made sure there was a record of it." Officer Martinez stood a few feet from the bench, his voice low but dripping with tension. "Sitting here, acting like you own the place," he said, glaring at Snoop. Snoop looked up from his relaxed position, his gaze steady and unflinching. "It's a public park," he replied evenly. "Nobody owns it." "You know what I mean?" Martinez snapped, his frustration reaching its boiling point. "You've been playing games with me all day, and I'm done. You're going to tell me who you really are, or I'll make sure you regret it." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a faint, almost amused smile. His calmness contrasted sharply with Martinez's growing agitation. "You really want to know who I am?" Snoop asked, his voice calm yet deliberate. "Enough with the smart remarks," Martinez growled, his hand inching closer to the baton on his hip. "Let's see some real ID this time. No tricks, no fake names, just the truth." Without breaking eye contact, Snoop slowly reached into his coat pocket. His movements were measured, deliberate, and unthreatening, but they still caused Martinez to tense. Martinez's hand tightened on the baton, ready to act at the slightest provocation. From his pocket, Snoop pulled out a sleek black smartphone. Its polished surface reflected the fading sunlight as he held it up for Martinez to see. "Here's the thing," Snoop said, his tone unshaken, carrying an air of quiet authority. "I don't need to prove anything to you. But since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll give it to you." Martinez's brow furrowed in confusion as Snoop tapped a few times on the screen. A video started playing, the vivid display lighting up the space between them. "What's this?" Martinez demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion. Snoop held the phone up, allowing the video to play. "It's a live stream," he said calmly. "It's been running all day. Every interaction we've had, every word you've said, every move you've made, it's all been broadcast live to millions of people." Martinez's face went pale as the footage played. The audio was crystal clear, capturing his words, tone, and actions with stunning clarity. It was undeniable evidence, and the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. "Wait, what are you talking about?" Martinez stammered, his grip on his baton faltering. Snoop stood up slowly, his full height towering over Martinez. His calm demeanor didn't waver, but there was a quiet strength in his presence. "I'm not Calvin Broadus," Snoop said, his voice steady and razor-sharp. "I'm Michael Carter, and today, I've been conducting an experiment to see how people in power treat those they think are powerless." Martinez's eyes widened in disbelief. "You're Michael Carter?" "The Michael Carter?" Snoop nodded. "That's right," he said. "And everything you've done today has been seen by millions of people in real time." Martinez's mind raced as the weight of the situation sank in. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His anger and humiliation collided, leaving him visibly shaken. "You set me up," Martinez finally said, his voice trembling with fury. Snoop shook his head slowly, his expression calm but firm. "I didn't set you up," he said. "I gave you a choice. Every action you took, every word you said, that was all you. I just made sure there was a record of it." "No tricks, no fake names, just the truth," Officer Martinez demanded, his voice sharp and forceful. Snoop moved slowly, reaching into his coat pocket. His deliberate, calm motions only heightened Martinez's tension, causing the officer to tighten his grip on the baton at his hip. His eyes never left Snoop's hands, ready to react at the slightest sign of a threat. But Snoop didn't pull out a weapon, nor another questionable ID. Instead, he produced a sleek black smartphone. The polished surface gleamed in the fading sunlight as he held it up for Martinez to see. "Here's the thing," Snoop began, his voice calm, yet carrying an unmistakable weight. "I don't need to prove anything to you. But since you're so determined to know the truth, I'll give it to you." Martinez's eyes narrowed as he watched Snoop tap on the screen a few times with a steady hand. The faint sound of a video's audio began to play, and the bright glow of the screen illuminated their faces. "What's this?" Martinez demanded, his tone laced with suspicion. Snoop glanced at the officer, his gaze unwavering. "It's a live stream," he said. "It's been running all day. Every word you've said, every action you've taken, it's all here. And millions of people have been watching." Martinez's expression shifted from anger to shock. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice trembling. Snoop turned the phone slightly, giving Martinez a clear view of the screen. The video displayed their earlier interactions in stunning detail, complete with crystal-clear audio. Martinez's tone, his words, his body language, all of it was captured without a hint of distortion. The realization hit Martinez like a freight train. His grip on his baton faltered, his hand dropping to his side. "You've been recording me this whole time?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just recording," Snoop corrected. "Streaming, live, to millions of viewers." Martinez's face turned pale as the weight of those words sank in. His mind raced, trying to process the implications. Every decision he'd made, every moment of tension, every aggressive word, it was all public. "You can't do this," Martinez said, his voice rising with a mix of panic and frustration. "This has to be illegal. It's entrapment." Snoop shook his head slowly, his calm demeanor never faltering. "It's not entrapment," he said firmly. "I didn't force you to say or do anything. Every choice you made today was your own." Martinez's frustration boiled over, his face flushing red. "You set me up," he spat. "I gave you a choice," Snoop replied, his tone even but resolute. "You chose how to act. All I did was shine a light on it. You're so determined to know the truth? Fine, I'll give it to you," Snoop said firmly. He tapped on the screen of his sleek black smartphone a few times, his movements deliberate and steady. A video began to play, and the faint sound of audio filtered through the device. Officer Martinez leaned in slightly, his brow furrowing in confusion, as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The screen showed footage of their earlier interactions in the park. Martinez himself standing over Snoop, his tone sharp and aggressive as he demanded answers. The video captured everything: the officer's words, their body language, and the tension in the air. Every detail was preserved with crystal-clear audio and visuals, leaving no room for doubt or ambiguity. "What is this?" Martinez demanded, his voice rising in a mix of alarm and anger. "This," Snoop said, his tone calm but resolute, "is a live stream. It's been running all day. Every word you've said, every move you've made, it's all been broadcast live to millions of people." The color drained from Martinez's face as the gravity of the situation hit him. His grip on his baton loosened, and his hand dropped to his side. "You're kidding," he muttered, his voice trembling. Snoop didn't flinch, Do I look like I'm kidding? He replied, his gaze unwavering. He turned the screen slightly, giving Martinez a better view of the live stream. The comment section was buzzing, lines of text scrolling rapidly as viewers reacted in real time. Martinez's breath quickened as he scanned the screen. The footage didn't just show their interactions, it highlighted the sharp contrast between Snoop's calm demeanor and Martinez's escalating aggression. The evidence was damning, and it was undeniable. "You can't do this," Martinez said, his voice shaking. "This has to be illegal. Some kind of setup." Snoop raised an eyebrow, his expression steady. "It's not illegal," he said. "And it's not a setup. I didn't force you to say or do anything. Every word, every action, that was all you." Martinez's frustration boiled over. "You've been recording us without consent? You've been streaming this? That's entrapment." Snoop shook his head, his voice remaining calm but firm. "Entrapment means I would have forced you into something you wouldn't have done otherwise. I didn't do that. All I did was sit here and let you make your own choices. And now, the world gets to see them for what they are." Martinez opened his mouth to argue, but closed it again, his mind scrambling for a response. The weight of the live stream, the audience, the evidence, was crushing. He glanced at the phone screen again, noticing the viewer count steadily climbing. The number was staggering. "You don't have the right to do this," Martinez muttered, his tone less confident now. "I have every right," Snoop countered, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This is about accountability. You're a public servant. Your actions should reflect that responsibility. But today, you showed everyone how you treat people you think are beneath you." Martinez's jaw tightened, his frustration and humiliation evident. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth, pointing a finger at Snoop. Snoop didn't react to the threat. Instead, he stood up slowly, his full height looming over Martinez. "You're right," he said, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. "This isn't over. It's just the beginning. Every interaction we've had, every word you've said, it's all been broadcast to millions of people," Snoop said, his voice calm but firm. Officer Martinez's face turned pale as the gravity of the situation hit him. His grip on his baton loosened, faltering under the weight of the revelation. What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice unsteady. Snoop stood up slowly, rising to his full height, his presence suddenly towering and commanding. The shift in his posture and demeanor was unmistakable. He no longer appeared as the quiet, unassuming figure on the bench. Instead, he exuded confidence and authority, as if reclaiming his true identity. Sliding the phone back into his pocket with deliberate care, Snoop locked eyes with Martinez. His expression was unyielding, his gaze sharp enough to cut through the tension in the air. "I'm not Calvin Broadus," Snoop said, his voice slicing through the moment like a knife. "I'm Michael Carter." The name hit Martinez like a punch to the gut. His eyes widened in disbelief, and his mind reeled as he struggled to process what he'd just heard. "What?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Michael Carter," Snoop repeated, his tone unwavering. "And today, you've shown the world exactly how you treat people you think are beneath you." Martinez blinked rapidly, his thoughts spiraling. He had heard of Michael Carter before, an internationally acclaimed musician, activist, and philanthropist. But to see him here, disguised and conducting what was clearly a calculated social experiment, was beyond anything he could have imagined. You set me up," Martinez finally managed, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and humiliation. Snoop shook his head, his expression remaining calm but firm. "I didn't set you up," he replied. "I gave you a choice. Every decision you made, every word you spoke, that was all you. I just made sure the world could see it." Martinez's frustration boiled over, his face flushing red. "You had no right to do this," he snapped, his voice rising. "I had every right," Snoop countered, his voice steady but commanding. "This isn't about me. It's about accountability. It's about exposing the truth. How people in power treat those they think are powerless. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Martinez opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The weight of the live stream, the millions of eyes watching his every move, was suffocating. Barely a whisper, Martinez repeated, "Snoop Dogg? You're kidding." Snoop's gaze didn't falter. "I never kid about things like this," he replied, his tone even but carrying a quiet authority that demanded attention. "I've been conducting an experiment, testing how people like you treat those you perceive as less fortunate." Martinez's mouth opened, then closed, no words managing to escape as his mind raced. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, each detail snapping together with painful clarity. The calm demeanor, the unshakable confidence, the deliberate way Snoop had handled every interaction, all of it suddenly made sense. The realization hit Martinez like a freight train. His actions throughout the day played on a loop in his mind, each decision now framed by the knowledge of who he had been dealing with. This wasn't just a random homeless man on a park bench. This was one of the most famous, influential figures in the world. And Martinez had played right into his hands. "You set me up," Martinez muttered, his voice shaking as he struggled to regain control of the situation. "I didn't set you up," Snoop replied, his tone steady and unwavering. "I gave you an opportunity to act with compassion, to show respect, to do your job with dignity. And instead, you chose to act with suspicion, hostility, and judgment. That was your choice, not mine." Martinez's frustration boiled over, his face flushing red with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You can't do this," he shouted. "You don't have the right. This is entrapment." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his expression calm but unyielding. "Entrapment? I didn't force you to do anything. Every word you spoke, every decision you made, you did that all on your own. The camera doesn't lie, Officer Martinez, and neither do you." Martinez took a step back, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. He glanced at the growing crowd of onlookers, their phones raised, recording every second of the encounter. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, words like abuse of power and disgrace rippling through the air. Snoop stood firm, his presence commanding. "This isn't just about you, Officer Martinez," he said, his voice carrying across the park. "This is about a system that allows people like you to act this way without accountability. And today, the world is watching." "You set me up," Officer Martinez finally said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and panic. Snoop didn't flinch, his tone calm and unyielding as he replied, "I didn't set you up. I gave you a choice. Every action you took, every word you said, that was all you. All I did was observe." Martinez's face flushed red, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You had no right," he spat, his voice rising with each word. "You had no right to do this." "I had every right," Snoop said firmly, his calm voice cutting through Martinez's outburst like a blade. "You're a public servant, sworn to protect and serve. But instead of doing your job with honor, you chose to harass someone you thought was beneath you." The words landed with the weight of truth, and Martinez instinctively took a step back, his confidence shaken. His breathing was shallow as he looked at Snoop, the crowd, and the phones recording every second of the confrontation. "You don't understand," Martinez said, his voice wavering. "You don't know what it's like out here. We deal with people every day, dangerous people. We can't just trust everyone." Snoop tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady and unwavering. "That's the problem," he said. "You don't see people. You see threats. You don't listen. You assume. And today, you let those assumptions define your actions in front of millions of people." Martinez's frustration turned to desperation. "This is entrapment," he said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "It's illegal. You can't just—" "Entrapment?" Snoop interrupted, his voice sharp but measured. "I didn't force you to do anything. No one told you to treat me the way you did. That was all you. And now, the world gets to see what that looks like." Martinez clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he struggled to process the situation. The crowd around them murmured louder, their judgment palpable in the air. Snoop took a step forward, his presence commanding but calm. "This isn't just about you," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's about a system that allows people like you to abuse power without being held accountable. And today, that system is being exposed." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. Martinez stared at Snoop, his frustration and humiliation evident, but he had no response. Martinez stepped back, his mind racing as he desperately tried to find a way out. "You can't use this," he said, his voice laced with panic. "This is entrapment. It's illegal." Snoop's expression remained calm, almost stoic. "It's not entrapment," he replied firmly. "I didn't force you to do anything, and as for legality, my lawyers would be more than happy to explain why you don't have a case." Martinez's panic deepened as the reality of the situation sank in. He glanced around, seeing the growing crowd, their phones raised and recording every second. The live stream, the audience, the undeniable evidence. It was all too much. For a moment, Martinez had believed he was in control, that he could assert his authority and bend the situation to his will. But now, it was painfully clear that Snoop had been several steps ahead of him the entire time. "You planned this," Martinez said, his voice trembling. Snoop didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "I plan to show the world how people like you treat those you think are powerless. And now, they see everything." Martinez's fists clenched, but he felt powerless against the tide that was turning against him. Every word he had spoken, every action he had taken, was now being judged by millions of eyes. The weight of the situation bore down on him, and for the first time, he realized just how far he had fallen into Snoop's plan. Outside Central Park, a crowd had begun to gather, their numbers growing with every passing minute. News crews rushed to the scene, their vans parked along the edges of the park, antennas raised high to broadcast the unfolding drama. Cameras zoomed in on the confrontation, capturing every detail. Reporters spoke in hushed but excited tones into their microphones, their words laced with anticipation as they described the tense encounter. Officer Martinez turned, his face flushed with humiliation as he realized the cameras were pointed directly at him. His name, his actions, his every word were now part of a story that was quickly spiraling out of his control. "This isn't over," Martinez said, his voice trembling with frustration and desperation. He raised a finger, pointing it accusingly at Snoop. "You won't get away with this." Snoop's expression remained calm, unshaken by the officer's threat. He locked eyes with Martinez and replied in an even tone, "It's already over." He motioned subtly toward the crowd. "The world's watching now." Martinez's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he looked like a man on the verge of either a breakdown or an outburst. The weight of his situation was undeniable. Every move he made was being broadcast live, and every word he spoke was being analyzed by millions. The younger officer's face was a mask of disbelief and growing panic. He glanced nervously between the crowd and Martinez, clearly aware of how disastrous the situation had become. His lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came. Snoop, standing tall and resolute, shifted his gaze briefly toward the cameras before turning back to Martinez. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "This is about accountability, about what happens when power goes unchecked." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Words like justice and abuse of power rippled through the onlookers, their collective judgment falling heavily on Martinez's shoulders. Martinez's face was a mask of panic and simmering rage as the full weight of the situation bore down on him. His eyes darted to the growing crowd of bystanders, their phones raised and capturing every moment. Then his gaze shifted to the approaching news crews, their cameras zeroed in, eagerly documenting every second of the unfolding drama. The sudden, suffocating realization struck him like a punch. He was no longer an authority figure in control of the situation. He had become a public spectacle, his every action scrutinized, judged, and broadcast to the world. "You think this makes you a hero?" Martinez spat, his voice dripping with venom. He pointed an accusatory finger at Snoop, his composure cracking under the pressure. "Dressing up and playing games? You're nothing but a fraud." Snoop didn't flinch. His calm demeanor remained intact, a stark contrast to Martinez's unraveling composure. He stood firm, his gaze steady and resolute, as though he had anticipated every word, every outburst. "This isn't about me," Snoop said, his voice steady and firm. "It's about what you do when you think no one's watching. But guess what? People are watching now. The whole world is watching." Martinez's finger wavered, his anger beginning to give way to the crushing reality of the moment. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, their voices filled with judgment and disapproval. One man in the crowd called out, "You're the one who looks like a fraud." Others began to chime in, their words cutting through Martinez's remaining sense of control. Snoop took a step forward, his presence commanding but calm. "This isn't a game," he continued, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It's about accountability. It's about what happens when power is misused. And today, Officer Martinez, you showed the world exactly what that looks like." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers echoing across the park. Martinez stood frozen, his face pale and his fists clenched, as the reality of his actions set in. As Officer Martinez's words echoed across Central Park, Snoop remained unshaken. His voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable firmness as he spoke. "This isn't about me," he said, addressing both Martinez and the growing crowd. "It's about accountability. It's about how people in positions of power choose to treat those they think are powerless." Martinez's frustration boiled over, his voice rising in desperation. "You're Snoop Dogg, for God's sake. You're a celebrity. Don't act like you're some saint coming down from the heavens." Snoop raised an eyebrow, his expression unmoved, as if Martinez's words had no effect. "Exactly," he said simply. "And yet you treated me like dirt the moment you assumed I was homeless." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices a low rumble of support for Snoop's statement. Martinez opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He glanced at the crowd, the cameras, and the phones recording every detail. The weight of Snoop's words, paired with the undeniable evidence of his actions, left him standing there, speechless. "You didn't see a person," Snoop continued, his tone steady but pointed. "You saw a problem. Someone you thought you could push around without consequences. But now you're learning that actions have consequences, Officer Martinez." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers reverberating through the park. Martinez stood frozen, his face pale, as Snoop's words struck him harder than he could have anticipated. "Imagine how you treat people who don't have the resources to fight back," Snoop said, his words sharp and unwavering. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their agreement palpable as they absorbed the gravity of what he was saying. At that moment, Officer Higgins arrived back on the scene, his face pale and drawn as he took in the chaos unfolding before him. He had been following the situation from the cruiser but hadn't anticipated the scale of what was happening. The gathering crowd, the cameras, the heated exchange, it was all spiraling out of control. Higgins marched over to Martinez, grabbing his partner by the arm and pulling him back. He leaned in close, his voice a harsh whisper. "Stop talking," Higgins said urgently, his tone filled with frustration. "You're making this worse." But Martinez, his anger boiling over, shook his head defiantly. "I'm not going to let him get away with this," he shot back, his voice trembling with fury. Higgins's grip on Martinez's arm tightened, his expression darkening. His eyes locked onto Martinez's, delivering a silent but firm warning that finally registered. Martinez hesitated, his shoulders tense as the weight of the situation began to sink in. "Look around, Danny," Higgins said in a low voice. "This is already out of our hands. You're not going to fix this by digging the hole deeper. Let it go." For a moment, Martinez looked as though he might argue. His jaw clenched, his fists curled tightly, but then his gaze flickered to the crowd, hundreds of eyes on him, recording his every move. The weight of their judgment was crushing, and slowly, reluctantly, he nodded. Higgins let out a relieved sigh, releasing his grip on Martinez's arm. "Good," he muttered. "Now let's get out of here before this gets any worse." "You already did," Officer Higgins said quietly, his tone heavy with resignation. His words cut through Martinez's growing anger like a blade, and for a moment, silence hung in the air between them. "Just stop before you dig the hole any deeper," he added, his voice barely audible above the murmurs of the crowd. The crowd's voices grew louder, a mix of disbelief and indignation rippling through the gathering. Words like abuse of power and disgrace carried through the air, their condemnation falling squarely on Martinez. The weight of their judgment was undeniable, and Martinez, for all his bluster, could do nothing to escape it. Meanwhile, the news crews had fully set up. Their cameras zoomed in tightly on the confrontation. Reporters spoke animatedly into their microphones, their words reaching millions of viewers across the nation. The scene was no longer just an incident in Central Park. It had become a spectacle, a symbol of something much larger. Snoop turned his attention to the crowd, his expression calm but purposeful. He stepped forward, addressing them with a voice that was both measured and commanding. "This isn't about one bad officer," he said, his words carrying over the murmurs. "This is about a system that allows behavior like this to go unchecked." The crowd's murmurs turned to applause, their support growing with every word Snoop spoke. Phones were raised higher, capturing the moment, and the reporters shifted their focus to him, recognizing that his message was the heart of the story. "It's not enough to call out injustice when it happens in front of a camera," Snoop continued. "We need to hold people accountable every single day, for their actions, their words, and their attitudes. Change doesn't start with laws or policies. It starts with us." The applause swelled, echoing across the park. Martinez stood frozen, his face pale and his fists clenched, as the reality of his actions, and their consequences, settled on his shoulders like a crushing weight. Addressing the crowd with the same calm authority he had shown throughout the day, Snoop continued, his voice carrying a resonance that demanded attention. "This isn't about one bad officer," he said, his tone steady yet impassioned. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about holding people accountable, not just for their actions, but for their attitudes." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers reverberating across Central Park. The sheer power of their approval shook the air, drowning out any remaining murmurs of doubt. Officer Martinez's face turned a deep shade of red, his humiliation written across every inch of his expression. He stood stiffly, his confidence shattered as he realized there was no way to regain control of the narrative. The applause was not for him, the cameras were not on his side, and the crowd's judgment was as clear as day. He glanced toward the cameras, his breath hitching as the realization dawned. Everything he had done, every mistake he had made, was being broadcast to millions. There would be no escape from this moment. Every word he had spoken, every action he had taken, would be dissected, criticized, and immortalized for the world to see. His every move was being broadcast to the world. The weight of the cameras and the judgment of the crowd pressed down on Officer Martinez like a crushing tide. "I didn't do anything wrong," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the noise. "I was just doing my job." Snoop turned his gaze back to Martinez, his eyes sharp and unwavering. "Your job is to serve and protect," he said firmly, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. "Not to profile, harass, or abuse your authority. And if you can't handle that responsibility, then maybe you shouldn't wear the badge." The crowd erupted into applause again, their cheers filled with agreement and approval. Martinez's shoulders sagged under the weight of their condemnation, his once confident demeanor crumbling. Officer Higgins, clearly desperate to end the scene, stepped forward. His tone, now pleading, was directed at Martinez, "Let's go," he said urgently. "We need to leave." But before the officers could retreat, another voice cut through the chaos, a commanding voice that silenced the crowd. "Officers, stand down." The crowd turned as one, their murmurs fading into silence as they saw a woman approaching. She was dressed in a crisp suit, her presence exuding authority. Her sharp gaze locked onto the officers, and the badge clipped to her belt identified her as Captain Emily Monroe, head of the Internal Affairs Division. Her mere presence shifted the energy in the park. Martinez's eyes widened as she approached, his face pale as the reality of the situation sank in even further. "Officers, stand down," the commanding voice rang out, silencing the murmurs of the crowd. Everyone turned to see a woman in a crisp navy blue suit approaching, her presence exuding authority. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had seen and handled it all, and the badge clipped to her belt gleamed under the afternoon sun, identifying her as Captain Jane Monroe of the NYPD's Internal Affairs Division. Her sharp gaze locked onto Officer Martinez, and he visibly stiffened. His eyes widened in shock as she closed the distance between them. The weight of her presence was unmistakable, and the crowd instinctively parted to let her through. "You've made quite a mess," Captain Monroe said coldly, her voice cutting through the stillness like a knife. "I hope you're prepared to deal with the consequences." "Ma'am, Martinez stammered, his words faltering as he struggled to explain himself. But Monroe raised a hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. "Save it," she snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I've already seen the footage, and it's clear the public has made their opinion known." She gestured toward the crowd, who were still watching intently. Their expressions ranged from outrage to quiet satisfaction as they took in every word of the exchange. Phones remained raised, recording every moment for posterity. Captain Monroe held up her hand, silencing Officer Martinez before he could utter another word. "Save it," she said sharply, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "I've already seen the footage, and I think the public's opinion is crystal clear." She gestured toward the crowd, who had begun openly booing Martinez. The sound of their condemnation filled the park, their judgment as public as the confrontation itself. Martinez stood frozen, his face pale, as the weight of the moment bore down on him. Captain Monroe then turned to Snoop. Her demeanor softened, a hint of regret in her otherwise firm expression. "Mr. Carter," she said, addressing him formally, "on behalf of the department, I'd like to personally apologize for what you've been through today. This behavior is unacceptable, and I assure you it will be dealt with." Snoop nodded, his expression unreadable, though his calm composure remained. "It's not about me," he said, his voice steady but firm. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The words struck a chord with the crowd, many of whom nodded in agreement. Monroe took a breath, clearly unsettled by the significance of Snoop's statement, but she remained composed as she responded, "You're right, it shouldn't happen to anyone else." Captain Monroe nodded at Snoop's words, then turned back to Officer Martinez. Her expression was unrelenting, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Hand over your badge and weapon," she commanded firmly. "What?" Martinez stammered, his face turning pale as the crowd fell silent, waiting for what would happen next. "You can't be serious!" "Do it!" she snapped, her voice sharp and decisive. "You're on administrative leave pending an investigation, and trust me, this investigation will be thorough." Martinez's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge from his chest and unholstered his gun. His movements were slow and hesitant, each action weighed down by the realization of what was happening. Reluctantly, he handed them over to Captain Monroe. His expression was one of utter defeat, his once confident demeanor completely shattered. As soon as the badge and weapon left his hands, the crowd erupted into cheers. Their voices were a mixture of triumph and relief, echoing across the park. For them, justice was finally being served. Phones captured every second of the dramatic moment, and the energy among the bystanders shifted to one of collective empowerment. As Officer Martinez was led away, his shoulders slumped in defeat, the weight of the moment visibly breaking him. His head hung low, his badge and weapon gone, as the crowd's cheers echoed through the park. It was a scene of public accountability, unfolding in real time, and every step Martinez took toward the cruiser felt heavier than the last. Snoop turned to face the cameras, his calm yet commanding presence drawing the attention of every lens and microphone pointed at him. "This isn't the end," he said, his voice resolute. "It's just the beginning. If we want to create real change, we need to hold people accountable, not just when they're caught, but every single day." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices reverberating through Central Park. The sound was one of unity, hope, and a collective call for justice. The weight of Snoop's words settled over everyone present, filling the air with a sense of shared purpose. Martinez, now stripped of his authority, was escorted toward the waiting police cruiser, his humiliation complete. He avoided eye contact with the onlookers, his face a mask of regret and shame. Meanwhile, the news crews remained focused on the unfolding story, their cameras zooming in on every detail. Reporters spoke animatedly into their microphones, narrating the powerful turn of events to millions watching live. Some reporters lingered, their cameras still capturing shots of the park bench where the day's events had unfolded. The bench, now empty, seemed to symbolize the quiet strength of one man's stand against injustice. Snoop remained standing near the fountain, his hands tucked casually into the pockets of his coat. To an unknowing passerby, he might have seemed like just another visitor enjoying a mild afternoon in Central Park. But the gravity of what had transpired was written in the air around him, a sense that something bigger had begun. Captain Monroe approached Snoop once more, her expression still marked by professional seriousness. "Mr. Carter," she began, addressing him with formality, "I want to personally assure you that this incident will be thoroughly investigated. The department does not tolerate this kind of behavior, and appropriate action will be taken." Snoop nodded, his calm demeanor unwavering, though his expression remained unreadable. "I hope so," he replied, his tone measured and firm. "Because it's not about one officer. It's about the culture that allows this to happen." "About one officer. It's about the culture that allows these things to happen," Snoop finished, his words carrying a heavy weight that seemed to linger in the air. Captain Monroe hesitated, clearly unsettled by the truth in his statement. She took a deep breath, her professional demeanor briefly faltering. "I understand," she said finally, her tone quieter yet resolute. "And I'll make sure your concerns are heard." With that, she turned and walked away, her posture stiff as if carrying the burden of the promises she had just made. Snoop, watching her leave, turned back toward the bench. The faintest trace of a smile played on his lips, an acknowledgement that the seeds of change had been planted, though the road ahead would still be long. He sat down again, pulling out his phone and scrolling through the live stream comments. They were pouring in by the thousands, each one a reflection of the audience's collective emotions: outrage, support, and shock at what had unfolded. "This is exactly why we need accountability," one comment read. "Snoop Carter just exposed a huge problem," another chimed in. "This isn't about one cop, it's about the whole system," someone else pointed out. Snoop's smile grew slightly as he typed a short response. "Change starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going." "We need accountability," one comment read emphatically. "Snoop Carter just exposed a huge problem," another chimed in. "This isn't just about one cop, it's about the whole system," yet another commenter pointed out. As the flood of messages continued, Snoop's smile widened slightly. He paused, taking a moment to type a response that resonated with the collective energy of the live stream. "Change starts with awareness. Let's keep the conversation going." Just as he set his phone down, an elderly woman cautiously approached him. Her silver hair shimmered in the afternoon light, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the leash of her small dog. Her presence carried a mix of curiosity and admiration. "I had no idea who you were," she said, her voice quivering but sincere. "But what you did, it's brave. You didn't have to do that." Snoop looked up at her, his expression softening. "Sometimes," he replied, "the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand. And sometimes, the only way to fix it is to shine a light on it." The woman's eyes glistened with gratitude as she nodded. "Well, thank you," she said earnestly, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you for standing up for all the people who can't." Snoop gave her a warm nod, watching as she walked away with her dog, her figure gradually fading into the crowd. His expression softened as he continued. "Sometimes the best way to understand a problem is to experience it firsthand, and sometimes the only way to fix it is to shine a light on it." The elderly woman nodded, her eyes glistening with gratitude. "Well, thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for standing up for all the people who can't." Snoop gave her a respectful nod, silently acknowledging her heartfelt words as she turned and walked away with her dog. He watched her retreating figure for a moment, then turned his gaze back to the scene around him. Nearby, the remaining officers were in conversation with their superiors. Their postures were tense, their heads slightly bowed as they awaited further instructions. The weight of what had just transpired was evident in their demeanor. Not far from them, Officer Martinez sat in the back seat of another police cruiser, his badge and weapon now stripped away. His head was buried in his hands, and the realization of his actions bore down on him like a heavy weight. His career, and possibly his entire life, was in ruins, and the gravity of his choices hung in the air. Sitting in the back of another cruiser, Officer Martinez had his head buried in his hands. His badge, his weapon, and perhaps his entire career, if not his very life, were in ruins. The consequences of his actions weighed heavily on him, the enormity of the situation finally sinking in. Nearby, Captain Monroe stood with a team of investigators, their expressions grim as they reviewed the live stream footage. The screen showed every word, every action, and every misstep, documented for millions to witness. Together, they pieced together the chain of events, their faces growing darker as the truth became impossible to ignore. For Snoop, this wasn't the end of the road. This was just the beginning. A single moment in what he envisioned as a larger, broader effort to address systemic issues that plagued society. He knew that meaningful change wouldn't come from a single viral event, but through sustained action and accountability. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Central Park, the once bustling scene began to quiet. The crowd thinned, and the murmur of voices faded into the soft hum of the evening. Snoop stood and stretched, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The quiet hum of a sleek black SUV pulling up to the curb caught his attention, and a faint smile crossed his face. From the vehicle, a young assistant stepped out, dressed sharply and holding the door open with practiced professionalism. "Ready to go, sir?" the assistant asked, her voice soft but respectful. "Not just yet," Snoop replied, his gaze sweeping across Central Park, as if he were taking in every detail one last time. The golden hues of the setting sun bathed the park in a warm glow, highlighting the tranquil beauty of the space that had just witnessed such a chaotic and pivotal moment. Turning back to the weathered bench where it all began, Snoop reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a pen and a small scrap of paper. With a thoughtful expression, he scribbled a few words onto the paper, his handwriting steady and deliberate. Once finished, he folded the note neatly and tucked it under the edge of the bench, as if leaving behind a quiet message for whoever might sit there next. The assistant raised an eyebrow, her curiosity evident, but she refrained from asking questions. Snoop had an air of purpose about him, and she knew better than to interrupt his moment of reflection. As he finally approached the car, he glanced back at the bench and the park one last time, his expression unreadable but contemplative. Snoop approached the car with a steady stride. Just before stepping in, he paused, glancing back at the bench where everything had started, at the crowd that had gathered, and at the officers who now stood in the shadow of their own reckoning. "This isn't just about me," Snoop murmured, his voice low, as if speaking more to himself than anyone else. It's about making sure everyone has a seat at the table, or the bench. With that, he stepped into the sleek SUV, the door closing with a soft click. The vehicle glided away smoothly, its tires barely making a sound against the road. Back at the park, the note Snoop had left behind fluttered slightly in the breeze, barely held in place under the edge of the bench. In neatly written script, it read, "To the next person who sits here, your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The simple yet profound message carried an unmistakable weight, resonating with the raw emotion of the day's events. As the crowd began to thin, their murmured conversations lingered in the air. People spoke about what they had witnessed, the abuse of power, the courage of someone willing to challenge it, and the collective responsibility to demand accountability. The bench, now an unassuming symbol of justice, became a quiet focal point for reflection. The people in the park murmured about what they'd seen, the stark display of power abuse, the tension, and the unexpected courage of one man who dared to challenge the system from something as simple as a park bench. This day would not just live on in news headlines. It had carved itself into the minds and hearts of everyone who had been there. For Michael Carter, known to the world as a legendary figure but disguised as an ordinary man, the work was far from over. This wasn't just about one park, one officer, or one confrontation. It was about planting the seed for something much greater. Every big change starts with a small spark, and Michael knew today had been that spark. As the sleek SUV glided through the streets of New York, Michael leaned back in his seat, pulling out his smartphone. Thousands of comments flooded into his live stream, filled with outrage, support, and introspection. Messages like, "This is why accountability matters." "Snoop just exposed something so much bigger than one cop." "We can't let this kind of thing keep happening." A faint smile played on Michael's lips as he scrolled through the flood of reactions. The spark had been lit, and the fire of change had begun to grow. The moral of the story was clear. Whether someone is given authority through power, wealth, or position, with that authority comes responsibility. Only through collective accountability can a world be built where dignity and respect are afforded to everyone, regardless of where they sit, what they wear, or who they are perceived to be. The story's message was unambiguous. Power, whether earned through authority or wealth, comes with immense responsibility. True change only happens when individuals hold themselves and others accountable. Only then can a world be built where dignity and respect are guaranteed for all, regardless of where they sit or how society perceives them. As the footage of Michael Carter's bold social experiment began circulating, it became a viral sensation, spreading like wildfire across social media, news outlets, and communities around the globe. The video sparked heated debates and impassioned discussions. Some hailed Michael's daring approach, applauding how he had pulled back the curtain on systemic flaws in law enforcement and societal biases. "This needed to happen," one viral tweet read. "It's about time someone put a spotlight on this issue." Others, however, questioned the ethics of his methods, debating whether the experiment crossed lines of fairness or integrity. "While I get the point, was it right to push people into these situations?" one news panelist commented during a live debate. Despite differing opinions, one thing was certain: the conversation had been reignited. Long-dormant concerns about accountability and systemic biases were now front and center, with people demanding action. While some continued to debate the ethics of the experiment, the impact was undeniable. A long-overdue conversation about accountability in law enforcement and societal biases had been reignited. Back in Central Park, life gradually returned to normal. Yet, the bench where Michael Carter had sat took on a new significance. It became something of a landmark, drawing visitors who had seen the viral video or read about the event. People stopped to take photos, some even sitting quietly on the bench, reflecting on the story behind it. Many left handwritten notes tucked under the edges of the bench, inspired by Michael's simple yet powerful message. "Your story matters. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." The phrase resonated deeply, especially with those who had faced discrimination or felt powerless in the face of authority. It became a rallying cry for change, and the bench itself became a symbol of resilience and hope for countless individuals. Shall I proceed? For Officer Martinez, the fallout was immediate and devastating. Stripped of his badge and weapon, he was placed under public investigation for his actions. Both his superiors and the public condemned his behavior, leaving him isolated and disgraced. The very authority he had once wielded so confidently was now turned against him, forcing him to confront the weight of his choices. His partner, Officer Higgins, while spared from formal disciplinary action, carried the heavy burden of knowing how quickly unchecked bias and poor judgment could escalate into something far worse. Witnessing the entire situation unfold had been a sobering experience for him. It forced him to reflect on his own role in enabling his partner's behavior, even indirectly. Higgins resolved to be more vigilant in his duties, vowing that he would never allow a similar incident to occur on his watch again. He recognized the need for systemic change, not only in their department, but in how society as a whole approached power and accountability. The experience became a defining moment for him, one that would shape how he carried out his responsibilities moving forward. Shall I continue to the next part? Meanwhile, Snoop returned to his work, carrying with him a renewed sense of purpose. The incident at Central Park had highlighted something bigger than just one confrontation. It had sparked a movement, one that he was determined to continue. Days later, at a press conference held in the bustling heart of Times Square, he addressed the events with the same calm authority he had displayed throughout. "This wasn't about embarrassing anyone," Snoop said, his voice steady as cameras clicked and reporters hung on his every word. "It was about holding up a mirror to ourselves as a society. We need to ask hard questions about the way we treat those we perceive as powerless and how we define justice, dignity, and equality." The crowd was silent, captivated by his words. Snoop's demeanor was not one of a celebrity basking in the spotlight, but of a man on a mission. He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a tone of urgency. "Accountability starts with each of us. It's not about pointing fingers. It's about making sure the systems we've built serve all people, not just a privileged few." His words resonated deeply, cutting through the noise of the city. They weren't just a commentary on the events that had transpired in Central Park, but a call to action for everyone listening, whether they were in the crowd or watching from home.